Okay, here we go. Kinesiology 230, Chapter 5. Still, we're talking presentation number 5, acute responses and endocrine changes. And when we look at where we are in the book, we're still in this part of the chapter, acute responses to training. It started on page 71, but we're a little bit further along now. And now we're in the main body systems for acute responses. And now we're on to endocrine. So when you talk endocrine, you're talking hormonal. And the there are many hormones that have an effect on growth and degradation of tissue. There's so many of them, but the book focuses on two primary hormone types, and that's protein and peptide, and then steroid. And when we break this out, let me get off my picture there. You have the protein and peptide side is or are growth hormone and insulin, and then the steroidal side is testosterone and estrogen. And I'm fairly certain you guys are all familiar with the terms for these. Pretty common to see this in any of the kinesiology courses and conversations about growth hormone, insulin, etc. But let's dig in a little bit further on the next slide. So if we break this out into anabolic hormones, you have the anabolic hormones stimulate a growth process, and you'll have testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, and then IGF-1, which is insulin-like growth factor 1. And then you'll have catabolic hormones, which work in the process of protein degradation to help maintain blood glucose in the body. And that's going to be cortisol. Now, I will tell you, when you start to get into doing some more reading in this course or maybe others, you'll start to see the term cortisol come up, and you'll see cortisol-like response, stress response, flight or flight, tied to cortisol production, causing inflammation in the body and in the connective tissue. So you'll start to see these connections made between these hormones and how the body responds to stressors placed on it. And one of the responses that comes about from stressors placed on the body can be the production of cortisol or having a cortisol-like response that causes the inflammation. I'm going to pause it on that because I don't want to get too far out of our 200 course here, because you can definitely go down a rabbit hole with that if you want to, and you got a weekend, you could probably look up a ton of stuff. But for right now, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So testosterone, it interacts with androgen receptors, and it upregulates the production of contractile and non-contractile proteins. And hypertrophy itself comes from the protein synthesis and the ability to take protein and use it to rebuild muscle. And these rates of protein synthesis, they're determined by the sum of non-contractile protein and the myofibril protein, the actin and the myosin. So you have two main camps here, one of which is the mitochondrial or sarcoplasmic, and then the other is the actin and the myosin. So they kind of are the two main areas in this process. And when you're talking about the muscle hypertrophy itself, they'll talk about muscle protein synthesis, but as we'll see here, we're going to talk about net protein balance in a moment, and there's two phases to this, and it's kind of a mathematical equation. It's the sum of the non-contractile protein and the myofibril protein on one side minus the demands. And this is a beefy paragraph, but I thought it was a great one, so I'm going to leave it here for you. If we look at this and just kind of break down this paragraph, in muscle, the sum of protein synthesis and protein breakdown rates is net protein balance. If we're in homeostasis, we have the sum of protein synthesis, the ability to have protein, and then break down protein. If they're equal, we're in equilibrium, we're in homeostasis. And what ends up happening is when we get out of homeostasis and out of the stable zone, we end up going in and we're going to throw some weights around. We're going to have a workout. We're going to have a big old chest day, and we're having a bout of resistance exercise. That's going to increase the net protein balance. So the body will end up elevating muscle protein synthesis rates to keep up with that demand. So think of it like it's an on-call system where when you go to work out or go to do activity, your body starts to increase the protein synthesis to meet the demands of the activity. Now what happens is during the initial phases of training, first couple of weeks, you have increases in muscle protein synthesis and the breakdown rates. So they kind of work together. And what ends up happening is the breakdown rates become less and less and less and less and less and less and less. And you have this kind of gap that starts to present itself between the synthesis rates and the breakdown rates, which gives you the gap to have more protein to be able to actually contract. So again, this is one of those topics where, man, you could really just run away with it, but I'm just going to keep it right there and kind of keep it simple. But what you're looking for is over time, the acute responses lead to the net result, or the accretion of more contractile and non-contractile muscle proteins, resulting in skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So what happens is, as you're working out, your body can keep up with the demands of the workout. And because you end up having a body that can create and ends up having, let me go back up here, you end up having greater protein synthesis, and the body can basically process that at a higher rate. You have a larger gap there, which allows for more contractile and non-contractile muscle proteins, which increases hypertrophy. So like anything in the body, it's a bit of a domino effect. And this one's a little bit wonky to try to wrap yourself around, but just realize it's a net protein balance. So you're taking one thing and subtracting it from another. In this case, you're subtracting the actual protein synthesis from, sorry about that, dog started barking upstairs. What's happening is you're subtracting the protein breakdown rates from the protein synthesis rates to give you the net protein balance. That's really what's going on here. All right, so I'm pretty sure you're going to see this on a test somewhere, that hormonal response to resistance exercises depend upon the characteristics of the training bout. As a general rule, bouts that have higher volume and shorter rest periods elicit a stronger endocrine response than do bouts with lower volume and longer rest periods, although they diminish over prolonged training. So long story short, what they're saying here is the hormonal responses that you'll see will be dependent upon the characteristics of a training bout. And depending on what you're doing, if it's low volume or high volume, or in this case, high volume and low volume, that's going to dictate the response of the endocrine system. Higher volume, shorter rest periods have a higher endocrine response. Now, if we take this a little bit further, if we look at large muscle mass exercises, they promote greater increases in anabolic hormones than do small muscle mass exercises. So now you start to put together what you can be doing in the gym to be able to have or to promote greater increases in anabolic hormones, like we saw a couple slides earlier. Well, it's going to be like these large mass building exercises, right? If you're going to have a hormonal response up here, what we're talking about is higher volume with shorter rest periods. So it just depends, but I'm pretty sure you're going to see that on a test somewhere else. All right, guys, breaking off from this, going to move to the next presentation.